915. Blood oaths, night attacks, life among medieval elite fighters. Imagine a courtyard at the edge of night, somewhere in the Frankish borderlands around the year 915. The torches are guttering in the September wind. 20 men stand in a rough circle, their breath visible in the cold air, each one gripping the hilt of a sword with both hands so that the blade points downward into the earth. They are not praying, they are swearing, and the words they speak are not liturgical Latin. They are the raw, urgent syllables of oath-taking, each syllable binding a man not merely to his Lord, but to something older and more terrible than any church ceremony could fully contain. This is the blood oath, and the men who live by it are among the most dangerous, most skilled, and most psychologically complex human beings the early medieval world ever produced. What we tend to picture medieval warriors through the romantic lens of the High Middle Ages, the gleaming plate armor, the heraldic tournaments, the courtly romances of Chrétien de Troyes. But to understand what fighting men actually were in the decades around 915, we have to strip away the poetry and the pageantry and look at something starker and more raw. This is the 10th century, a world still finding its shape after the collapse of Carolingian order. The Frankish Empire that Charlemagne had built with such ambition has fractured into competing principalities. Viking raiders still sail up the Seine and the Rhine. Magyar horsemen terrorize the eastern marches. Saracen pirates operate out of fortified mountain bases in the Alps. In this world, a fighting man's survival depended not on loyalty to a distant king he might never meet, but on the immediate, personal, and almost sacred bond between a warrior and his sworn companions. The Latin term used in Carolingian and post-Carolingian documents for these elite household fighters is gasindi, or, more commonly in the Frankish tradition, vasi. The English translation most historians reach for is vassal, but that sanitized word does not fully capture the intimacy and the danger of the relationship. A 10th century Gasindus was not simply a soldier on retainer. He was a man who had placed his physical survival entirely in the hands of another man, and who in return had surrendered enormous autonomy. The ceremony of commendation, documented in formularies from the period, involved the warrior placing his hands, clasped together, between the palms of his lord. This gesture, which later became the standard posture of Christian prayer, was originally a warrior's gesture of total submission. It was a moment of extraordinary vulnerability, deliberately performed in front of witnesses, and it was the foundation on which the entire military culture of the early Middle Ages was built. These elite fighters did not live like the later knights of the 12th and 13th centuries. They did not have individual castles as their private domains, because in 915, the stone castle, as we understand it, barely exists yet. The fortifications of this era are mostly timber and earthwork constructions, the motte and bailey predecessors of later stone keeps, or repurposed Roman structures. The warriors themselves lived communally in the hall of their lord. The Great Hall was not merely an architectural feature, it was the social universe of the fighting man. He slept there, ate there, trained in its courtyard, received his equipment there, and in many cases would die defending it. The chronicler Flodoard of Reims, writing in this very decade, records the daily rhythms of such communities with a matter-of-fact precision that strips away any illusion of glamour. And these men ate communally, drank communally, and were expected to be combat-ready at any hour of the day or night. The night attack deserves particular attention because it was not the exceptional act of desperation that later chivalric culture would frame it as. In the military reality of 915, attacking at night was often the tactically rational choice, especially for smaller forces operating against fortified positions or supply lines. And the annals of Fulda and the various regional chronicles of the late Carolingian period are filled with references to nocturnal raids, surprise assaults at dawn, and the burning of granaries and mills under cover of darkness. For the elite fighters who carried out these operations, success required a specific and demanding skill set that went far beyond simple swordsmanship. It required the ability to move quietly through forests and across open ground, to maintain group cohesion in the dark using minimal sound signals, to navigate by stars and landmarks, and to suppress the natural human panic response when the disorientation of combat in near-total darkness made it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from enemy. The weapons these men carried reflect the brutal pragmatism of the age. The primary sword of the 10th century Frankish or Saxon warrior is what modern typologists call the Viking Age sword, a pattern-welded or occasionally monosteel blade of roughly 75 to 90 centimeters, with a relatively broad fuller running along the center to reduce weight without sacrificing structural integrity. Archaeological finds from the Rhine and Loire river valleys, where swords were frequently deposited as ritual offerings or lost in combat, show blades of remarkable quality, some bearing the inlaid inscriptions of specific smiths or workshops. A sword of this quality was extraordinarily expensive, to roughly equivalent in value to several oxen or a substantial parcel of land. Only men of the elite warrior class would typically carry one. The spear, by contrast, was the universal weapon. Long-shafted, leaf-bladed, and effective both as a thrusting weapon and a throwing weapon at short range, it was what most fighting men actually used when battle began. The training of an elite warrior in this period was a lifelong process that began in childhood. The son of a warrior household would typically be placed in the hall of a more powerful lord by his early teens, beginning as a personal servant before transitioning to weapons training under the supervision of senior fighters. This institution, which the Franks called the Skara, or military household, was the functional precursor of the later knightly training system. The young trainee learned mounted combat, certainly, but he also learned the management of horses, the repair of equipment, the reading of terrain, and something far more intangible but equally essential, the political and social intelligence required to navigate the intense personal rivalries and factional dynamics of a warrior hall. The Waltherias, a Latin epic poem composed somewhere in the Carolingian cultural sphere, and roughly contemporary with our period, gives a remarkably detailed picture of exactly these dynamics. Its hero, Walter of Aquitaine, is not just a fighter. He is a man constantly calculating alliances, managing obligations, and measuring the loyalty of those around him with the cold precision of someone who understands that a misread friendship can be as lethal as a misread enemy. The blood oath itself carried a psychological weight that we struggle to fully appreciate from our secular modern vantage. In a world where the Church was actively trying to monopolize the sacred, the blood oath represented a quasi-pagan survival, and a form of binding that drew its power not from ecclesiastical ceremony, but from something older and more visceral, the shared risk of violent death. Men who had fought together in night raids, who had held a line together against Magyar cavalry, who had dragged each other through the frozen mud of a siege, developed a bond that the formal ceremony of commendation only approximated. The actual texture of that bond was forged in combat and consolidated in the hall over years of shared meals, shared danger, and the peculiar intimacy of men who have seen each other at the absolute extremity of human experience. This intimacy also had its shadow side. The chronicles of the period are full of betrayals, of sworn companions who turned on their lords when a better offer materialized, of men who held blood oaths as tactical tools to be discarded when circumstances changed. The murder of Archbishop Fulk of Reims in 900, carried out by warriors in the service of a powerful Frankish magnate, is only one of numerous examples of the period's casual capacity for political violence carried out by men who considered themselves honorable. The code of the warrior hall was not the later chivalric code. It was tribal, personal, and fundamentally transactional, even as it was expressed in the most emotionally intense ceremonial language available to the culture. A lord who could not feed his men, equip them, or lead them to profitable victory, would find his hall emptying with remarkable speed, regardless of whatever oaths had been spoken. The diet of these fighters tells us something important about how the warrior culture maintained itself physiologically. Manor records and the food renders documented in various Frankish polyptychs suggest that elite warriors consumed extraordinary quantities of meat compared to the peasant population. Pork was the prestige food of the hall, and followed by beef and mutton. The archaeological record from high-status sites of the period shows cattle and pig bone assemblages that dwarf anything found at peasant settlement sites. Bread made from wheat, or spelt rather than the rye and barley of the peasantry, ale of a higher quality, and periodic access to wine for feasts all marked the physical distance between the warrior class and the agricultural laborers who supported them. This caloric advantage was not merely a social marker, but a genuine military asset. A fighter who ate well was stronger, healed faster from wounds, and could sustain the physical demands of wearing heavy equipment, riding long distances, and fighting at the end of a forced march. The equipment itself was becoming more sophisticated in this period in ways that would have enormous consequences for the next several centuries. The nasal helmet and the hauberk of interlocked iron rings, how, while not universal, were increasingly available to men of the warrior household class. A well-equipped fighter of 915 might wear a knee-length coat of mail over a padded undergarment, carry a large convex shield of lime wood and leather, and fight behind that combination with a degree of confidence that significantly altered the tactical calculus of a night raid or a pitched engagement. The investment required to produce and maintain this equipment meant that it was intimately tied to the lord-warrior relationship. The lord typically provided the weapons and armor. The warrior maintained them, trained with them, and ultimately proved their value in combat. When a warrior left his lord's service, the question of who owned the equipment was frequently a source of violent dispute. What made these men elite was not simply their weapons or their training. It was their proximity to power and their role as the physical instrument of a lord's will in a world where the mechanisms of state coercion were primitive by modern standards. The Carolingian administrative system had relied on counts and missi dominici to project royal authority. But by 915, that system was under enormous strain. In its place, local strongmen exercised authority through the simple fact of having armed followers who would enforce their demands. The elite fighter was therefore not just a military asset, but a political one, a walking demonstration of his lord's capacity for organized violence. His presence at a negotiation, his participation in a judicial proceeding, his appearance at the gate of a subordinate's estate all communicated the same message with perfect clarity. The legacy of these men, the Gassendi of 915, is woven into virtually every institution the High Middle Ages would later develop. The tournament, which becomes such a central feature of 12th and 13th century aristocratic culture, has its distant origins in the training exercises of the warrior hall. The feudal system of land tenure in exchange for military service formalizes and bureaucratizes what was in 915 a much more personal and contingent arrangement. The chivalric code, with all its elaborate rhetoric about courtesy and honor, and the protection of the weak. Chutis is in many ways an attempt by the 12th century church and courtly culture to domesticate and redirect the ferocious energies of a warrior tradition whose roots reach back to exactly this moment. A torchlit courtyard, 20 armed men, and words spoken in the dark that no one present intended to forget. The next time you look at a medieval illumination showing a knight in burnished armor, surrounded by heralds and ladies, riding toward a tournament field with banners flying, try to see behind it. See the earlier image. The exhausted fighter sleeping in his lord's hall with one hand on his sword hilt. The man who crossed a frozen river at midnight to burn a rival's grain stores. The young warrior placing his hands between his lord's palms and swearing in a voice so low only the witnesses closest to him could hear the words. That man built the world that the later, more famous knight would inherit. He built it in blood and in darkness, and in the absolute currency of personal loyalty, in a world where loyalty was the only protection that reliably worked. This is the story we rarely tell about the Middle Ages. and it is perhaps the truest one. If this chapter of the medieval world speaks to you, tell us in the comments which corner of this era you want to explore next. Every age has its fighters, its codes, and its darkness. The 10th century had all three in remarkable abundance.